From a woman at a zipline course who decided she knew better than everyone before stepping off a platform, to a passenger on a boat standing at the bow mid-argument as the water around them got worse. I'm Timothy from Last Memories, and I'll be sharing Karen deaths so dumb they make me question if things can get any worse. It was October 9th, 2017, on a zipline course carved into the hardwood ridge above Gatlinburg, Tennessee, where fall foliage pulls tourists in by the tens of thousands, and the elevation gives the impression that height is something you can manage in a weekend. Rhea Wadsworth, 34, worked as a retail floor supervisor at a home goods chain in Knoxville. 8 months earlier, her husband had filed for divorce after discovering an affair. The settlement gave her alimony and primary custody of her 6-year-old daughter. Friends told investigators the trip had been funded from that settlement, 2 weeks with her daughter placed with a sitter, and the zipline course booked as what she had described to a friend as finally living for herself. The course operated on platforms anchored to mature hardwoods above a forest floor, ranging from 30 to 90 feet below. The longest run stretched roughly 600 feet, feeding into a braking zone that required the rider to hold a specific body position. Staff fitted her harness to spec before the launch. She objected 3 times, saying the waist strap was too tight and affected her breathing, and argued with staff that they were over-tightening it. Staff explained the tension was structural and walked her through why, but she dismissed their explanation. After they moved to assist someone else, she apparently reached down and loosened the waist belt by at least 2 notches. In doing so, she also slackened the leg loops and disturbed the positioning of the harness on her hips, creating visible slack across the waist and upper leg junction. Another participant saw her do it and said something. Rhea dismissed them, said she didn't need to be managed, insisted she knew what she was doing, and even cursed at them. I think about that exchange a lot. Someone saw it, said something directly, and it still didn't change what came next. She launched without incident at first. The guide at the send platform saw nothing irregular on exit. Her form looked standard. Witnesses positioned on an adjacent viewing platform noticed her body sitting noticeably lower in the harness than other riders partway through the run. Her hips had dropped below the expected position, and the leg loops, now bearing the primary load, had begun to compress upward against her thighs. Staff at the receiving platform were alerted by those observers and began preparing to slow incoming riders, but she was already committed to the line with no way to stop mid-span or intervene once she was in motion. As she entered the braking zone and approached the far platform, she raised her legs, the instinctive and incorrect response from someone with no training on the system. The unloaded waist belt shifted upward. The leg loops followed. Witnesses on the receiving platform described a sudden drop of several inches within the harness, her body lurching downward in a single visible motion. At that point, the harness had ridden high enough on her torso that her center of mass was no longer securely seated in the leg supports. She grabbed the overhead cable with both hands. She slipped free of the harness in that moment and was no longer supported by the line, leaving the trolley continuing along the cable without her. At the speed she was traveling, the line tore through her grip almost instantly. She fell approximately 25 feet before reaching the receiving platform. She struck packed dirt feet first, but the impact drove her legs upward and pitched her forward immediately, her chest and head meeting the ground in the same motion. 2 staff members reached her within seconds. Her breathing was labored and uneven, each exhale audible from several feet away. A third dropped to her side and held her head still. None of them moved her. Course staff called emergency services immediately, but her breathing stopped before EMS arrived. She was pronounced dead that afternoon. The coroner determined the cause of death to be severe closed head trauma with acute subdural hemorrhage, cervical spine fracture at C3 through C4, and bilateral tibial fractures consistent with high-impact ground contact following a fall from elevation. Her ex-husband was awarded full custody of their daughter in the weeks that followed. The course was cleared of operational fault. The incident was attributed entirely to riders' modification of required safety equipment. I believe Rhea wasn't reckless in the way the word usually gets used. I think she was someone trying to reclaim a sense of control in a period where most of it had already been taken, and she expressed that in the one place where it genuinely wasn't hers to take. So this next one really got to me. She had someone telling her to turn back the entire time, and she followed him anyway, still arguing, all the way to the edge. It was September 11th, 2018, and by early afternoon, the heat pressing through the chaparral of Angeles National Forest had already crested 90 degrees. the kind of dry, still air that makes every footstep on pine needle-covered ground sound like paper tearing. A Tuesday that gave no indication of what it would become by midday. Janelle Priss was 33 years old and worked part-time as a real estate assistant at a mid-sized agency in the San Gabriel Valley. She had been in the role for 4 years, known among colleagues for pushing back when she thought something was wrong. One of her close friends said that she had planned the hike as a solo day trip to a ridgeline overlook she found on a local outdoors forum, arriving at the trailhead just after 10. Apparently, she was not an experienced hiker, but I think she doesn't seem like the kind of person who perceived that as a limitation, which ultimately became her downfall. She stopped near a trail fork to ask a park volunteer named Mark Umstead for directions to the overlook. Mark was 22, a college student 2 seasons into his volunteer role with the local Forest Service. He directed her left at the fork. Mark said that Janelle believed he had sent her the wrong way after walking that route and finding nothing, and she came back furious, insisting he had given her incorrect directions and refusing to accept his explanation. The exchange that followed was one-sided. She was insistent, increasingly loud, and followed him onto a service maintenance path behind the trailhead kiosk, continuing to argue, despite him telling her it wasn't a public trail. I've been to that part of the national forest where the service path runs along the upper edge of a drainage slope, a narrow strip of packed dirt that gives way to a steep decline covered in dry pine needles over hardpan clay. The slope drops roughly 60 feet before flattening into a debris field of fallen timber and embedded sandstone. It's widely known that it is not a trail. It is not maintained, signed, or intended for foot traffic. Volunteers familiar with the area avoided it for exactly that reason. Mark told her twice to go back to the main path. He kept a step of distance as he spoke, not reaching for her, staying on the packed portion of the path while she remained at the unstable edge, ignoring him and continuing the argument instead of stepping back to stable ground. She stayed to his left, at the edge where the packed dirt gave way to the needle-covered grade. I think about this moment a lot, not as a judgment, but because it's the kind of detail that looks like nothing at all until it already is something. Her left foot went first. Mark later told investigators she stepped slightly off the path edge while gesturing, and the needle layer gave way instantly beneath her shoe. She reached sideways and grabbed a finger-thick sapling. It snapped at the base. She went down the slope on her side, not tumbling but sliding fast and low, her body accelerating across 40 feet of loose needles and bare clay. During the investigation, Mark said that she struck a root cluster roughly 15 feet down that partially rotated her body sideways. She hit a rock outcrop with her right hip and continued sliding, now face down. Her legs caught a protruding root another 20 feet below, and her upper body swung forward, her left shoulder striking a half-buried rock and rolling her fully over. Mark was at the path edge shouting for her to dig in, to grab anything. At that speed and angle, it would not have mattered. She collided with a large fallen log at the base of the slope. Her momentum carried her torso over it so that she landed headfirst on the downslope side, the crown of her skull striking hard clay and embedded rock with the full force of the descent. She did not move after that. Mark scrambled down to her in under 2 minutes. Her breathing had stopped entirely before he reached her side. Mark radioed for help immediately from a service radio he carried as part of his volunteer kit. A Forest Service rescue team reached the site in approximately 35 minutes. Responding personnel assessed her condition and determined death at the scene. Mark Umstead took his own life 2 months later. Friends told investigators he had barely spoken since the incident and blamed himself for not physically stopping her from stepping onto the path. I don't think Mark was responsible for what happened, but knowing that and feeling that are entirely different things, and the distance between them can be unbridgeable. Ready for another one? This next, Karen left a review online calling the trail overhyped, and she went back alone to prove she was right. It was June 14, 2016, on a narrow canyon trail cut into the basalt and shale walls above the Snake River in southern Idaho, where an unusually heavy spring runoff had left the canyon faces still shedding material in irregular, unpredictable sheets. Marielle Lily Sturka was 38 and worked as a freelance copywriter based in Boise. She had built a modest following through long-form reviews of hiking trails and outdoor destinations across the Pacific Northwest, and was known among her circle for being direct, and for rarely leaving a published opinion undefended. 3 weeks earlier, she had posted a detailed complaint about this specific trail, calling it tourist safe and overhyped and arguing that its difficulty rating was manufactured for liability purposes and that people were overstating the actual risk. She returned specifically to document the trail a second time and had texted a friend the evening before that she planned to push further than her first visit. She arrived at the trailhead alone at approximately 8:40 in the morning. A couple preparing to leave warned her about recent rockfall near the lower descent section and described the gravel as worse than usual following the spring melt. She acknowledged them, dismissed the warning as exaggerated, and continued. Park Service postings near the entrance also noted unstable ledge conditions in the lower corridor. The canyon narrows sharply below the first mile marker, where the trail drops through switchbacks cut into loose shale and decomposed basalt. After significant runoff, the gravel layer can accumulate 2 to 3 inches deep over smooth underlying stone. Marielle bypassed the rope, choosing not to use it despite the posted warnings, and began sidestepping down the gravel face. A retired geologist named Thomas Reddick was hiking below and later reported to investigators that he had been monitoring the descent section for several minutes before she appeared, noting small slides coming off the wall at irregular intervals. He described watching her footing shift twice about halfway down before she continued descending rather than retreating to the rope. Her right foot skidded on a flat shale slab, roughly 30 feet from the base of the descent. She dropped to a seated position. Thomas described it as a deliberate attempt to lower her center of gravity and control her speed. The gravel beneath her did not slow. It was released in a continuous forward sheet and carried her body with it. Her body accelerated down the remaining slope. Thomas later told investigators that she struck multiple outcrops on the way down, including at least one impact to the right side of her body and another higher on her torso, though he could not determine the exact order of contact. He described her movement as uneven and partially rotating as she slid, rather than a straight descent. He reported that her head made contact with the slope at least once before she reached the bottom section, though he could not say exactly how. She reached the ledge drop, approximately 18 feet of near vertical exposure, still moving. Thomas stated that she went over the edge without stopping, her body still turning as it cleared the drop. He described the impact below as a single hard strike against the lower rock shelf, followed by a short, uncontrolled roll of several feet before she came to rest against a boulder. Thomas called 911 immediately. She was conscious and attempting to breathe when Thomas reached her after about 3 minutes. She had visible chest deformity on the left side and blood present at the mouth. He said that he tried to keep her awake, but she lost responsiveness within approximately 1 minute of his arrival. Rescue teams arrived 42 minutes later, their response delayed by terrain that required a technical rope approach into the lower canyon. She was confirmed dead at the scene. The medical examiner found that her injuries were consistent with multiple high-speed impacts across a sloped rock face, followed by an uncontrolled 18-foot fall onto flat stone. The trail was temporarily closed for slope stabilization. The rope assist was replaced and extended. Her original review remained accessible online for several months before the account was deactivated. What I keep returning to is that the warning sequence here was unusually complete. A verbal warning at the trailhead, posted signage at the entrance, and the ground visibly shifting under her twice before she committed to the final stretch. Marielle was experienced enough to recognize something was wrong and still chose to continue rather than retreat. At least with a canyon, you can argue the terrain was unpredictable. This next story takes place on a road she drove every single day, and she still didn't make it home. It was May 27, 2015, on a residential connector road in the southwestern floodplain of Houston, Texas, where 5 days of compounding rainfall had overwhelmed every drainage channel in the corridor, and where a woman's certainty that she knew better than a police barricade would put her inside a submerged car within the hour. Colleen Drury was 38 years old and worked as a processing clerk at a regional insurance firm, a position she had held for 6 years. Co-workers later said she filed formal complaints rather than letting things go, and had escalated 2 workplace disputes to the regional HR office in the past year alone. She was described as someone who did not accept other people's assessments of her own situation. That evening, she had left the office early as the rainfall intensified. Her apartment was less than a mile from the barricaded road. Investigators pieced together from traffic camera footage that she arrived at the police cordon, spoke with an officer for about 90 seconds, which became a verbal altercation, then reversed and circled the barrier using a parallel side street. The officer later told investigators he had warned her the water depth was unknown and still rising, that he could not guarantee passage for any vehicle, and that she told him she knew the road. He had no legal authority to detain her. Floodwater in low-lying urban corridors does not behave the way a dry road looks. The surface appears flat, and it gives no indication of what is below it or how fast it is moving. Kassin Brohl, a contractor driving a pickup truck several lengths behind her, later told investigators he watched her sedan enter the standing water at roughly 10 to 12 miles per hour. The water rose from the lower quarter of her tires to the midpoint of the door panels as the vehicle began to lose traction, the current pushing unevenly against it. The car continued forward briefly before stalling in the flooded section. Brake lights came on and it came to a stop in the middle of the road. She attempted to restart the engine. This is established by the battery state recovered from the vehicle, significantly depleted, consistent with repeated ignition attempts after the engine stalled in deep water. Each attempt discharged the battery further and brought her nothing. I think about this sequence a lot. Within a few minutes of the stall, water had reached the lower door frame. At that depth, the hydrostatic pressure holding the door shut from the outside can quickly make it extremely difficult to open, especially as the water level outside rises higher than inside. The door would have become extremely difficult to open as the water outside rose higher than inside. Kassin watched her climb into the back seat. He saw her striking the rear window repeatedly with what appeared to be a hard object, a phone, possibly a shoe heel. Automotive side windows can be difficult to break without a proper tool, and repeated blows with improvised objects often fail to shatter them in time. The window did not break. The current increased enough to push the car into a slow, uneven pivot across the road surface, turning it partially sideways. Kassin later described that movement to investigators as slow and steady, which he said made it harder to watch than if it had been sudden. Her movements became visible through the glass as water inside the cabin rose to chest level, then neck level, then they stopped entirely. The cabin was fully flooded, and there was nothing anyone watching from the road could do. Kassin called 911 immediately after the engine stalled. Swift water rescue units arrived 14 minutes later. Visibility in the floodwater was near zero. Recovery teams located the vehicle that night. Colleen Drury's body was found in the rear passenger compartment. As I read the story, I kept thinking how thin the line was between inconvenience and fatality, and how quickly her confidence erased that margin. She didn't misread the danger, she rejected it, and that decision gave the water just enough time to take control of everything. And in the next story, a woman drove 9 hours for a single photograph, and the rangers could see exactly what was coming before she could. It was July 22, 2014, when a 60-foot ridge drop in the South Dakota Badlands would put a woman in peril who decided, weeks in advance, she was not leaving without a photo. Tamra Lyle was 45 years old and had worked as an administrative assistant at a mid-sized legal firm in Omaha, Nebraska, for 11 years. Her father said that landscape photography was her outlet. She maintained a modest online following, shared geotagged photos from prior trips, and was known for standing by her opinions and pushing back when challenged. The Badlands had been on her list for over a year. Friends said that she had researched the specific ridge through other photographers' geotagged posts, identified the angle she wanted, and timed the 9-hour drive around a roughly 40-minute window near sunset, when the formations appeared deep amber, which does not reproduce in other seasons or other light. Eyewitness testimonies said that she arrived mid-afternoon and spent several hours working different overlook positions before settling on the one she had planned for. The ridge she had chosen sits on a formation built from millions of years of erosion, compressed layers of clay, volcanic ash, and fine silt that photograph beautifully and fail without warning. Around 6 p.m., a park ranger moved through the area and advised visitors that conditions on the exposed ridge were deteriorating. Most people turned back. Tamra dismissed the warning and repositioned closer to the edge. The ranger warned that he could not physically prevent visitors from going onto the ridge but would radio for backup if someone appeared in immediate danger. And Tamra continued forward, as if the warning did not apply to her. The gusts had been steady for several minutes before the character of them changed. Fine dust began moving in horizontal sheets across the ridge surface, and loose gravel rolled off the edge in thin streams. Denny and Ruth Ellison, a couple in their late 50s, were standing roughly 30 feet behind Tamra when the wind shifted direction. The Ellisons later told investigators it changed twice in under a minute, a rotational effect consistent with fast-moving air hitting vertical rock. Tamra stepped closer to the drop, widened her stance, and lowered her center of gravity. The next gust hit harder than the ones before it. Her upper body pitched forward. She caught herself. The Ellisons confirmed she did not go over immediately, but her right foot had shifted onto a section of looser sediment sitting over angled rock below. Once her hands pressed into the unstable material, the loose sediment began to crumble beneath her, causing a short, uncontrolled slide that twisted her body as she tried to regain footing. She dropped to one knee. That was the last controlled movement she made. The outer edge of that ridge runs at roughly 25 degrees before it becomes vertical. Once her knees were on that surface, the material beneath her hands gave way in a continuous, incremental failure. Not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling. Several seconds passed. The Ellisons described her body twisting, sliding, and tumbling forward, arms and legs flailing as the loose surface peeled away in sheets with each attempt to stop herself. She cleared the edge in a messy, uncontrolled descent. She struck a ledge approximately 15 feet below the rim. The Ellisons heard the impact. She continued descending, hitting at least 2 additional ledge faces before coming to rest 60 feet below the starting point. Denny Ellison called park services immediately. She was obviously dead from that fall, and rangers arrived 27 minutes only to confirm it. I personally believe the rangers' advisory should have been a formal warning with immediate closure of the ridge until the area could be stabilized, rather than a casual suggestion, and backup personnel could have been deployed to enforce the perimeter. The additional warning signage installed at the ridge afterward addresses the visible surface of the problem while leaving the structural one, enforcement, exactly where it was. The ridge remained open. The Ellisons gave their statements to investigators and drove home. Every account frames Tamra's refusal to leave as the beginning of the explanation for what happened, and I understand why. But a woman standing on a ridge that a ranger had just described as deteriorating, and a ranger with limited authority to physically prevent her from crossing the dangerous area, is not a story with a single clean cause. All right. This next one genuinely annoyed me putting it together because it didn't start with a storm or a cliff or a freak accident. It started with a refund. It was August 3rd, 2015, on a 22-foot open-hull tour vessel running off the Alabama coast in nearshore Gulf waters, 3 miles from shore. And before it reached the dock that afternoon, a passenger was in the water, and then she was not coming back out. Seren Dahl was 41 and worked as an office manager for a property management firm in Mobile, where she had spent 11 years building a reputation for precision and a low tolerance for what she considered substandard service. Colleagues described her as effective and organized, someone who got results but treated every transactional dispute as a matter of personal principle. She was not widely disliked. She had booked the dolphin-watching excursion alone, a trip she had put off for years, and arrived at the dock with a digital camera. She lodged her first complaint before the boat left the slip. The vessel looked smaller than the photos suggested. She exchanged words with the captain twice before they cleared the marina. I think about people like Seren a lot when I research these cases, and what I keep landing on is that nothing she did that morning was unusual for her. That's the part that makes it hard for me to sympathize with. The vessel, built for calm inshore conditions, began taking side swells against the hull roughly 40 minutes into the run, and the ride at the bow grew noticeably unstable as wind speeds increased to near 20 knots. The captain reduced speed and announced a return to the dock, offering a partial refund. Every other passenger moved toward the center of the vessel as directed, and all passengers had life jackets available, but some were not wearing them. Seren stayed at the forward rail, one hand gripping the metal tubing, continuing to argue that partial was not acceptable. The captain repeated the instruction. She did not move. As the boat began its turn back toward shore, the bow caught a sequence of irregular side waves. A witness, Cale Morse, a contractor seated amidships, later told investigators the hull pitched left and then corrected sharply. Seren lost her footing and went to one knee briefly before standing again. She still remained at the rail. Roughly 8 seconds later, a larger wave struck the port side at an angle, dropping the bow and swinging it hard. Her grip on the rail broke. She fell sideways, her left rib cage striking the top rail with her full body weight before she went over the rail. The vessel was running at reduced speed. Seren surfaced within seconds, disoriented and audibly gasping. A deckhand immediately threw a standard ring buoy, while the captain handled the radio and maneuvered the vessel, landing it within 15 feet of her. She turned toward it but could not orient her movements to close the distance. A secondary swell pushed her lengthwise along the port hull. Cale Morse later described the sound, a flat, repeated impact, as her shoulder and side struck the fiberglass hull over several seconds. She reached for a secured deck line near the stern, and her hand closed on nothing but water, and her arm went under. She came up once more, face upward, then rotated face down. Witnesses reported no further purposeful movement for roughly a minute to a minute and a half in the water, and honestly, that detail is the one I couldn't stop thinking about while reading this. The captain had cut the throttle and was already on the radio. The captain radioed for emergency assistance immediately and began circling to close the gap. Recovery took 12 minutes. Emergency services met the vessel at the dock 25 minutes after the distress call. She was unresponsive on arrival and was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner noted blunt force trauma to the left thorax, including 3 fractured ribs with 1 displaced inward, and pulmonary edema consistent with drowning. The captain was cleared of negligence. The investigation confirmed he had issued verbal safety instructions to all passengers, that the life ring deployment met standard response time, and that all required equipment was aboard and properly accessible. He returned to work several weeks later, after taking time away from the dock, and gave no public statement. Cale Morse told investigators he replayed the moment her hand missed the rope for months. He said it looked, for a second, like she was going to reach it. I've covered a lot of incidents where someone made a decision that sealed the outcome, and usually there's something underneath it worth sitting with. This one is harder to complicate. The captain gave an instruction. She didn't follow it. Everything after that was physics.